Welcome to all of you participating tonight and to our distinguished panel members. This is the third year that we've created a Zoom format program, which has the great advantage of allowing us to invite panelists not only locally from out of town, and this year out of state. And we also are able to create an audience that goes beyond our county borders. Our panel discussion tonight is part of the programming created for Kern County's 2030 One Book Project, which is our countywide reading and discussion initiative. It's coordinated by Kern County Library and California State University, Bakersfield, along with many community partners, such as Emmanuel. One Book was created in 2002, and each year hundreds of people across the county read or listen to that year's book and are invited to discuss its powerful themes. This is the sixth year Emmanuel has created a panel discussion for One Book. It is our aim to create a compelling conversation looking at the themes of each year's book from a faith-based perspective, which makes us kind of unique for the programming that takes place every year. Our panelists will lift up that perspective for it, but it will be up to us, the audience, to ask the kind of questions of the panelists that will create a lively conversation. And now, let me introduce to you Paul Sally, who is this evening's Zoom technician. Paul?
Thank you, Christy. I just wanted to take the time to let everyone know that periodically I might be muting you, and if you have any questions later on, you can raise your hand. There is on the toolbar of Zoom, if you look at the bottom of your screen and hover over your toolbar, it should appear. And then there is a reactions tab. You can click on that, the actual happy face, and then there is a raise button there that you can raise your hand when we get to the Q&A. Otherwise, you can just put something in the chat and I will do my best to keep track of all of your questions. We're going to do a balancing act between going from Zoom questions here and then going back and forth with chat. And that's pretty much it. I'll give it back to you, Christy.
Okay, thank you, Paul. All right, let me introduce our panelists for tonight. Alan Salazar is a Chumash and Tatavian tribe elder, a native storyteller, and a published author. His ancestors were brought into the San Fernando Mission in 1799. He is a founding member of the Kern County Native American Heritage Preservation Council, and he's been a preschool teacher and a juvenile institution officer. He presents educational programs at schools, museums, and at cultural events nationwide. Alan is also a traditional paddler and a builder of Chumash canoes. Dr. Shahir Afaki is a CSUB Assistant Professor of Religious Studies. He was born in Lahore, Pakistan, and obtained his PhD from Indiana University in Bloomingdale. His research explores the world of Islamic thought and culture. He studies medieval and modern religious ideas and practices in South and West Asia, and is also interested in interreligious relations, particularly Christian-Muslim encounters. He particularly admires his CSUB students' passion for understanding how religion influences the world in nuanced and sophisticated ways. Rabbi Jonathan Klein serves as the rabbi of Temple Bethel in East Bakersfield while living in LA. In addition to leading worship, teaching, and supporting his congregants' spiritual journeys, Rabbi Klein has been active on boards and nonprofits supporting social and economic justice for low-income Angelenos and those most vulnerable in Bakersfield. He is a staunch promoter of bipartisanship and pluralism, stating, Gandhi teaches that no one religion has all truth. All religions are needed to obtain absolute truth. Reverend Craig Alan Satterley, who wins the prize tonight for coming the longest distance from Michigan, is the Bishop of the Northwest Lower Michigan Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He has served as an adjunct professor in the theology department at the Lutheran School of Theology at Notre Dame, where he also received his PhD. Bishop Satterley is the author or co-author of 10 books and numerous articles in both scholarly and ecclesiastical journals. Our panel moderator tonight, Pastor Dawn Wilder, has served as pastor of Emmanuel Lutheran since 2017. She has a rich variety of life experiences, having served as a classroom teacher and operated a drop-in center for homeless and underprivileged youth in West Hollywood for 10 years. She has worked as a hospice chaplain and bereavement counselor and completed a 2-year residency in clinical pastoral education at UCLA Medical Center. She also holds an MA in technology-based education from CSU Dominguez Hills. Pastor, take it away.
Trying to unmute myself here.
Oh.
That's always my... You wouldn't know that I had a master's in technology-based education. Good evening. I'm Pastor Dawn Wilder from Emmanuel Lutheran Church here in Bakersfield. And I want to reiterate what Christy's welcome of our panel and all of our guests here this evening. I also want to acknowledge the people who submitted the questions in advance. We will try to answer those questions as best we can, especially those that relate directly to faith and religion. One of those questions I'm going to answer up front here. It was a question specifically about the title of our program tonight, Beautiful, Broken, Blessed. And the question they're asking is regarding that title. And it says, are differently abled people offended by the implication they are broken for having a disability? And the short answer, I think, is yes, or probably. That certainly is what I got in reading Rebecca Tausig's book, Sitting Pretty, The View from My Ordinary Resilient Disabled Body, which is the one book program here in Kern this year. In the book, she relates a story where a woman insisted on praying for her healing, specifically that her legs would be healed and that she would be able to walk again. And Rebecca, she politely declines, but finally relents to this woman who keeps asking, and she relents to this prayer of blessing, which really ended up being a veiled prayer for healing anyway. The woman, she only saw someone broken and in need of healing. And her prayer of blessing was, I think, a little self-serving. And it left Rebecca welling up in tears. The thing about the title of this program, I guess in my limited study for this evening, that looking at a variety of different faith traditions and the ways we connect to our spirituality, that in the area of disability, they generally fell into these categories. Some seeing disabilities as blessed or a blessing, perhaps the person receiving an extra blessing in the next life because of their challenges in this one. Some of them seeing beauty, that people with disabilities complete the image of the eternal, complete the human circle. Others see brokenness. Perhaps it's in the need of healing or maybe brokenness needs to be accepted by the person. I'm thinking of karma, kind of like better luck in your next life. The thing I wonder is, how do these views contribute to or counter ableism? In preparing for this evening, I wrote to the author to get her take on the topic for the evening, and she wrote back. And a part of what she said was, in my church community, growing up, there was a narrative that my cancer and paralysis were evidence of the fallen world. The idea was that before sin, disability didn't exist. So my body became sort of a symbol of the fall. And it was also my job to show God's redemption and grace through my broken body. So my smile became a symbol of God's goodness. It was a heavy weight. I hope that tonight some of that weight can be lifted. And with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Bishop Craig Satterlee.
And there I am. Good evening. My name is Craig Satterlee. I'm Bishop, an ELCA bishop in Michigan and Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I'm also legally blind. So the essence of the Christian faith, the mystery of the Christian faith, is that God became human in Jesus, suffered with and for us on the cross, and was raised to new and abundant life. And in the Gospels, the risen Jesus reveals himself to his disciples by showing them in John his hands and his side, and in the other Gospels, his hands and his feet. So he is showing the disciples his crucified body, his broken body. So we might say that a broken body, a disabled body, reveals God. And so we might say that Christians proclaim, pray to, and praise a disabled God. Of course, Christians normally don't think of it that way. They've never been taught that. They're surprised when they hear it because the church has had some other approaches to people who live with disabilities. For some, disabilities are a sign of personal sin. So the disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" So disabilities are a consequence of personal sin. Jesus answers, of course, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that the power of God might be revealed in him. We normally think then, oh yes, the power of God will be revealed in him when he is healed and made quote unquote normal. But in the Gospels, if we pay attention to the readings, God's power is revealed sometimes before the healing takes place in terms of faith or devotion or courage. But we distort that one sometimes and say that disabilities are a sign of lack of faith. If only people with disabilities would have more faith, they would, be healed. The assumption is that the most important concern in a person who lives with disabilities life is being healed. Well, I can tell you in my life, it is not. These days, it's not even on the top 20. My top concern today is what's going on in the Middle East. So that's another bias we seem to have, that people who live with disabilities, their primary or exclusive concern is their disability, and it's not. For still others, disabilities becomes an object lesson. So it's really not about the disability. It's a metaphor for us, normal people, whatever that means. And so my church especially is really good as it seeks to promote justice, is to use ableist language to promote justice. So we are blind to the oppressed and deaf to the cries of the poor, which basically sends the subtle message that being disabled is bad. Or disabilities are an inspiration. People were made disabled to, to inspire people who are not disabled, to know God and to be amazed and all of that stuff. Basically, we've forgotten that people who live with disabilities are people first, created in God's image, loved for Christ's sake, and empowered with the Holy Spirit. So how, in Christian terms. So I invite people to consider people with disabilities as models of discipleship or examples of faith. And I think of in the Gospels the story of Bartimaeus, who was born blind, and who, when he finds out Jesus is coming, cries out, in spite of the fact that people tell him to be quiet. And Bartimaeus is a beggar, and when Jesus calls him to come to him, Bartimaeus throws aside his cloak, which has all the money from his begging. It's his one possession. It's what he uses to keep warm, what he sleeps under. He throws it aside. Now, I can tell you as somebody who doesn't see, when you throw something aside, you're never going to get it back again. He really is throwing away his old life to embrace this new one, which earlier in the Gospels, we have heard that a rich young man with many possessions could not do. So I invite people to consider people who live with disabilities as revealers of God, just like everybody else, and to look to them to be for ways they can teach us of what it means to be a disciple or an example of faith, just like everybody else. So the bottom line is, from my Christian perspective, people who live with disabilities are children of God, beloved by Christ, and partners with us in the work of God's kingdom. Thanks. Did you all go to sleep?
Not muted.
You're muted.
I'm actually glad I was muted because I completely said the wrong thing. So thank you, Bishop. Those very insightful, and certainly I've referenced to others the resurrected body of Christ still had its wounds, but it never really occurred to me to frame that as worshiping a disabled God. So that is a helpful contribution. Thank you. Our next panelist this evening is sorry. Our next panelist this evening is Dr. Shahir Afaki.
Thank you. I'm just trying to share my screen. Okay. Right. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I first of all want to thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel discussion. And I also want to thank you for the introduction. I do want to announce before I go ahead that the perspective that I'm presenting here draws heavily upon the work of Muhammad Ghali, who is a scholar of religion and disability with a focus on Islam. Additionally, I do want to say that there are various kinds of texts that we can draw upon in order to search for. Just checking if there's something in chat for me. No, sorry about that. So there are various kinds of texts that one can draw upon in order to search for a perspective on Islam and disability. For this very short presentation, I'm primarily going to draw upon Muslim theological and legal texts. I also am going to focus primarily on the pre-modern tradition. The modern perspective is going to be perhaps more familiar to everyone. I'll say a bit about that towards the end, but I'll start with the pre-modern. So to begin with, one of the points that most historians of disability in the Islamic world, or Islamic thought, I should say, emphasize and roughly agree upon is that when we look at pre-modern Muslim theological texts, it is difficult to find any category that would even come close to our modern category of people with disabilities. And so that point is in itself intriguing, and scholars have tried to come up with various explanations for why that might be the case. The perspective that I find to be compelling and helpful in terms of understanding this phenomenon has to do with the theology of the Quran itself and God's scheme in terms of salvation and how spiritual status is determined in Islam. So, as many scholars themselves emphasize, in Islam, fundamentally, our spiritual status, our worth from the Creator's side of the scale is determined by the effort that we put into cultivating God consciousness, right? It is not contingent upon the physical or mental capacities that we are born with, but rather how we draw upon those physical or mental capacities in order to come close to God, in order to worship Him, and in order to make positive contributions to society. And for this reason, so say I have problems with memorization, which is a very important kind of an aspect of participating in Muslim rituals. I am not going to be held accountable, and it does not reflect my status in any way. What I do need to do is use the limited capacity for memorizing material to the extent I can in order to participate in Muslim rituals, and I will be evaluated according to that. On the other hand, there may be individuals, or less, I'll just speak about myself, I may be in a position where I have all kinds of faculties, all kinds of capacities that are generally seen as normal, in quotation marks, and I may misuse them, or I may misdirect them. And that is where we head into a spiritually problematic domain from the perspective of Muslim theology. So most scholars who are trying to reconstruct today, most scholars who are trying to reconstruct Muslim notions of disability, theological notions, will emphasize that what the Quran and what pre-modern Muslim thinkers fundamentally considered problematic is self-inflicted spiritual disability, a form of disability that you inflict upon yourself through the misuse of the capacities that have been granted to you. And so these scholars will also emphasize that pre-modern Muslim theology offers a resource, and in their time themselves, they tried to counter processes of othering that were often applied to people with disabilities in their era. They emphasized that one's spiritual dignity has nothing to do with the state one is born in, physically or mentally. And this is also one of the reasons that when we look at Muslim legal texts, we find that what we today consider people with disabilities, so they do not have a separate category, but they are placed, we randomly find them coming up, turning up in this broader category of what's called, roughly translates to people with exemptions. So under Islamic law, humans are eligible for various kinds of exemptions from various religious rituals, depending on not just their biological or intellectual situation, but external factors as well. So if one is expecting a child, pregnant women, they do not have to fast during the month of Ramadan. But it's not always going to be tied to biology either. If you are traveling, you can shorten your prayers, your daily ritualistic prayers, or postpone them, for example. And so what we understand as people with disabilities are placed in this much broader category that isn't necessarily always even tied to the health of the body or the mind, but just to the situation. If you are born in a context where Muslims are being politically oppressed, then certain exemptions are going to apply to you as well, which goes back to the theological principle that the emphasis is not on spiritually othering what, again, we moderns understand as people with disabilities, but on simply trying to understand how different laws will apply to them and creating accommodations for them, but again, not singling them out as a specific group. And you find all kinds of characteristics in this broader category. So bald people have some exemptions, all kinds of categories. So this is the overarching framework in the pre-modern system. I will say a bit about the modern period, starting the 19th century, but particularly after the mid-20th century, with the growth and the popularization of the medical model of disability, but also particularly, so in post-colonial Muslim societies, which were recovering from the political humiliation, but also economic deprivation that came with European colonialism, in the aftermath of that encounter, and as countries gain more freedom towards the mid-20th century, there is obviously, and this is a characteristic of modernity in general, there is an emphasis on economic productivity as defining the worth of citizens. So you need to be a member. You can only be a fully functioning member of society if you are contributing to GDP in an effective manner. With these notions disseminating and becoming popularized, there is obviously an impact on Muslim thought as well. And so what we have today, if we randomly select a sermon regarding Islam and disability, what you would find is, on the one hand, there will be an emphasis on values such as compassion and kindness towards people with disabilities. And I understand that, but implicit in those discussions is now also a kind of a theology of ableism. And this is why I think, and I mean, many scholars who specifically work on this subject believe that deeper engagement with the pre-modern work on this broader subject can help us deepen our understanding and help us generate a more nuanced theology of disability, and hopefully counter the processes of othering that come with modernity. So thank you. That's all from my side.
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't really know that didn't know the nuances between pre-modern and modern uh, Muslim theology, and there seems to be just a deep compassion embedded in the pre-modern theology, and it is kind of I wonder how those issuances of compassion can help all of us better counter ableism that we find in our various religious institutions and spiritualities. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Alan Salazar.
Aku Hamanat Netawan Alan Salazar, Pasekva Nukusin, Chogoyanga, Tapu Nukusin. Hello, I'm Alan Salazar. I'm from the villages of Pasekva, Chogoyanga, and Tapu. Pasekva is San Fernando, California. It's where I was born. It's where my tribal ancestors are from. That's on my father's side of the family. And we trace back to the Tataviam village of Chogoyanga in Santa Clarita and the Chumash village of Tapu in Simi Valley. As I've been listening to the speakers, I've kind of been thinking about what I want to say, and I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks. One thing that stood out to me as everyone was being introduced, I went to Bakersfield Junior College. That's it. So I'm at a distinct disadvantage education-wise. But I thought about my tribal beliefs and how I was raised to be proud of my indigenous ancestry. And when you look at where we're at today in the world, coming from a culture that doesn't have a written language, we have oral histories. I think there might be an advantage in that when you don't have a written language, you have to sit down and talk. You have to sit down and listen. And that's what Native American cultures are based on, sharing stories. One of the things that makes me proud to be Chumash and Tataviam is that there aren't any words in our language for sin. It was the concept that is foreign to us. There aren't any words for disabled or crippled. Those are foreign concepts to us. We deal with our natural world and how we fit in it. That's our religion. I tell a creation story that the Chumash believe there's 3 levels to the world: the upper world, the middle world, and the underworld. The upper world is held up by the great golden eagle. The upper world is on the wings of the golden eagle. Sky coyote, the sun, the moon, and morning star are in the upper world. They're the sky people. The middle world is a big island held up by 2 giant snakes. And then there's the underworld where there's supernatural, scary things. It talks about how we view the universe, how we view the world, and we don't rule it, we don't control it. We are part of it. It's a subtle difference, but it's very important. It was Chief Seattle that said, "We didn't weave the web of life. We're just merely a strand in it." That's our philosophy on how we fit into the world. I've asked various elders and anthropologists and people that are much more intelligent than I am about this topic, and there's not much out there in the native cultures about it. But let me share a story, because I'm talking about oral traditions, and I'm a storyteller. Once there was 3 young boys. They were around 12 or 13 years old, and it was the time of their life that they were going to go off and have a dream vision. And like many young boys all around the world, regardless of where you're from and what culture, the young boys were hoping to go off and have dreams of animals that were big and strong: bear, eagle, mountain lion, animals that would teach them lessons that would make them young, that would make them strong and wise. And the 3 boys went off together one night after fasting for several days. And the first boy didn't travel very far. He stopped along a creek and he built a fire, and he stared at that fire all night. And finally, late in the night, he went to sleep. And while he was asleep, he dreamt of a giant white-headed bird, a bald eagle. And when he woke in the morning, he was very glad that he dreamt of the eagle, because it's very strong, it's swift, it's powerful, and he knew he would learn many lessons from the eagle. The second boy went a little bit farther up the mountain and found a nice little clearing and built his fire and stared at that fire all night until he finally went to sleep. When he went to sleep, he dreamt of a big grizzly bear. And when he woke up in the morning, he was so glad that he dreamt of the grizzly bear, because the grizzly bear is big and strong. It's the biggest, strongest animal we have here in California. And he knew he would learn many lessons from the grizzly bear. The third boy had heard that you have the most powerful, strongest dreams at the top of the mountain. And he hiked all the ways to the top of this mountain. When he got up there, it was windy and dusty, but that's where he built his fire. And he stared at that fire all night, and he finally went to sleep. When he went to sleep, he dreamt of an acorn. And when he woke up, he thought, what kind of dream is that? What can I learn from a little acorn? And when the 3 boys went back to the village, the other 2 boys told everyone in the village what they dreamt of: the bald eagle, the bear. But the young boy who dreamt of an acorn didn't tell anyone. He was a little confused and didn't know what his dream meant. So after a couple of weeks, the young boy who dreamt of the acorn went to the wisest man of the village, an old elder. And he told the old elder what he had dreamt of and asked him, what does it mean? And the elder told him, everything and everyone has its own dream, its own gift, its own power. The bear, the eagle, the mountain lion, the wolf, even the rabbit, the lizard, the squirrel, the small creatures, the spiders, all of us have our own dream, our own gift, our own powers. And he reached into his pouch and he gave the young boy an acorn. He says, take this acorn and find a good place to plant it and water it and care for it, sing songs to it, and you will learn lessons from this acorn. And the young boy did. He took the acorn, he found a really nice place, planted it, watered it, and after a couple weeks, a month, from this little acorn, an oak tree started to grow. And the more he watered it and took care of it, the taller and taller the oak tree got. And the young boy felt good about his dream. Many years went by. The young boy who dreamt of an eagle was a great hunter. He had great vision, was swift and strong. And one day, when he was a young man, he came into the village with a big buck on his shoulders that he killed. And everyone in the village gathered around the young boy who dreamt of the eagle and said, man, we sure are glad that the young boy who dreamt of the eagle is a member of our village. He's swift, he's strong, he has great vision, he's a great hunter. Provides a lot of food for everyone in the village. The young boy who dreamt of the acorn thinking, okay, I haven't learned that much from that acorn other than an oak tree grows from it. A couple of weeks go by. The young man who dreamt of the bear comes into the village with a basket, a big basket, 3 feet around, 4 feet deep, full of fish, 30, 40 fish in this basket. And everyone in the village gathers around the boy who dreamt of a bear. And they go, man, we sure are glad you're a member of our village. You're big and strong. You're such a great fisherman. You can catch fish with your hands. You don't even need a harpoon or a fishing hook. And the young boy who dreamt of an acorn once again started questioning his dream. After a couple of weeks, he went back to the elder.
Lost the speaker.
We're gonna miss the whole point.
You got text.
Alan, you're muted. There we go.
There we go. Can you hear me again?
Yeah, yeah.
Got to go back? The boy who dreamt of the acorn goes back to the old elder and says, a tree grew from this acorn. It's 30 feet tall, but that's about all I've learned is from an acorn, you can grow an oak tree. And the old elder told the young man the same thing he told him when he was a young boy. Everyone, everything has its own power, its own gift, its own dream. The bear, the mountain lion, the eagle, even the rabbit, the squirrels, the lizards, the spiders, they all have their own gift, their own dream, their own power. All of us have our own dream, our own gift, our own power. And the elder told the young man, go to your oak tree and stand there by your oak tree and watch. Just sit and watch. And the young man went by his oak tree, got a little bit away from it, and he sat there and he watched. And over the days and the weeks, he sat there. And he saw the bear come and eat some acorns, scratch his back against the trunk of the tree, that spot he can't get. He saw the eagle come down and get acorns. He saw deer, woodpeckers, all kinds of animals come and collect the acorns. He saw his tribal members come in and collect the acorns. He saw the woodpeckers building their nest up in the tree. And the young boy who dreamt of an acorn realized that the oak tree gives freely to everyone and everything, and shares and protects many people and many animals. And that young man who dreamt of an acorn, when he became older, he became a very respected elder. And he gave freely of everything he had. He was very patient with the young people, very kind and understanding with the old people. And he became the wisest person of his village. And everyone in his village said, we are sure glad that the boy who dreamt of an acorn is a member of our village. As simply as I can put, I think that's the native philosophy, that all of us, regardless of what disabilities we have, as the pastor would say in the Christian religion, no one is perfect, everyone is a sinner. So in the tribal beliefs, we all have our own gifts, our own dreams, our own powers. We don't look at people with disabilities any different than we do than anyone else. What are their gifts, their dreams, their powers? When you look at people that we label in America as disabled, they have gifts and powers that I don't have. And that's how we look at them in the Native community. Thank you for allowing me to share a story with you. I hope it gives you a little insight to our tribal cultures throughout America and here in California. And I look forward to the Q&A. Kiwanan.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a beautiful story, and I love how there is this sense of contribution from everyone, no matter what state they may be in. I think that's a piece of what ableism and robs. I think we as a culture are robbed of the contributions that disabled people with disabilities are able to make when all we see is their disability rather than the whole contribution of who that person is. So thank you very much for your story. Our final panelist this evening is Rabbi Klein.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. So thank you to all the previous panelists for their thoughts on this question about disability and our religious communities, our religious cultures. We each have, I mean, within each of our traditions, there are probably multiple cultures. But I would just start by saying that there's a lot of ways to approach this question. There's the question of what do our, and I appreciate it in particular hearing from Shahira Faki for the a Muslim perspective, because just as Sharia law is associated with all sorts of rules about who can or cannot do certain things, so too Jewish halakha, which is basically the same thing, has a whole series of what you can or cannot do. And I don't have the expertise in the facility that you do, Shahir. So pardon me for not really going in that direction. I want to acknowledge, though, that is a central piece of the conversation, especially in more traditional circles regarding disability, about diversity, neurodiversity. I want to expand our minds a little bit from the physical disability category to the neurodiversity approach, because I think that we often in our culture either ignore the mental health questions, or we don't associate them with disability. And one of the things I do when I do a funeral, there's a tradition in Jewish tradition of rending your clothing, you tear it. I always tell people that tear is so that we make visible what's invisible otherwise. When people are living in a state of grief, when they've lost a loved one, not everyone is aware that they've lost that loved one. So it's important. In our tradition, we wear, even though the tradition is to say we rip our clothes because we're showing our grief, I think it's also an indicator of wanting to make visible what is otherwise invisible, so that people have a visual code that says this person is suffering. And so I really want to make a strong push for recognizing mental health disability, the way in which people struggle with their capacities, and which is a challenge that we deal with culturally. Hopefully, I think we're making progress societally, but we still don't quite know how to deal with it. So my introduction to disability really comes from the day my brother was born. Before I was born, I have a brother who, when I was born, was 6 years old. Bobby had Down syndrome, and had a significant Down syndrome, in that he really, we used to say mentally retarded, and now culturally that's seen as outside the purview of what we say. Yet I grew up with that, so I still say it because that's my brother. He passed away when I was in high school, so it's complicated for me, all of these things. But I know that developmental disabilities are very much, and his was a combination, I would say, of physical and mental health. His body was physically different than mine. His capacity to speak was significantly impeded by his Down syndrome. So anyway, I grew up with that. He was my brother. In those days, we didn't mainstream people as much, and so he lived in a foster family, and that has had an impact on me lifelong. I wrote up my High Holiday sermon this year, addressing the impact of having a brother who was here but was not here, and I'll save you the details, but it really is an interesting piece about how we relate to people who are just different than us. I also grew up in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, where my rabbi, Solomon Kleinman, Alav Shalom, he founded a synagogue in Arleta which became known as Temple Beth Solomon of the Deaf. So there was an attempt to create a community that would be understanding of those who were deaf in the San Fernando Valley. It's gone as an institution for the most part, but I just think that that's part of my early understanding of my Jewish community. We were trying to find ways, imperfect as it was, to be inclusive without knowing that we were really trying to create inclusion. We just were trying to make sure that people felt like they had a space, which I guess is the same thing. I just think in our tradition in Judaism, which I know is a foundational religion for other religions represented on this panel, that you know that Moses essentially had a speech impediment, right, in the Torah. It says that he, at the same time, became known as the greatest prophet in Jewish tradition ever. So the person who was our greatest prophet also had difficulty speaking. Isn't that interesting? Hannah in the book of Samuel speaks erratically, and the priests in the temple chambers say, what is going on with you? Are you drunk? That kind of thing. And nevertheless, she births the prophet Samuel, who becomes really important in our tradition because he basically finds King David. So, that's interesting. The Torah itself has wonderful teachings. And I just want to say, the important thing to understand, I think, when we look at these things, and I say this as a rabbi who's deeply committed to the tradition, the thing is that there are what the laws say, and there's what the traditions say, and then there's how we live it out. And those are not always the same thing. And religion is not just about what we read in books. In fact, I would say it's probably 20% of what we read in books for most of us. And the other 80% is how we live it out in our communities. And so I just think it's very important, as I tout the greatness of Jewish sources, that we also hold it in its proper place, which is to say there was an attempt that these laws suggest of trying to recognize the inherent worth and value of all human beings, but human beings often fall short. So I will say in Leviticus chapter 19, it says, do not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Well, we know there's a lot of stumbling blocks before those who are dealing with various forms of diverse physical and mental capacities. There's a lot of them. I remember in my synagogue growing up, a different one, actually, the one that my mother worked at, they had these little devices you could wear. There were a lot of older folks in the congregation, probably some of our churches in this community or mosques or other religious institutions may have similar things that you put on your head, and the microphone would have a direct lead so that those who had hearing impairment could hear what was going on. I was very that was just what I grew up with, just like my Temple Beth Solomon of the Deaf. It was an attempt to be inclusive, and I think it was a beautiful thing. And I think it had to do with our older folks. So it may have been that those older folks said, we can't hear, what can you do for us? And that's how it happened. It probably did not happen accidentally. My sister is struggling with her eyesight right now. She's had her eyesight all of her life, but she's now at a point where her eyes are not as strong, just sort of like the prophet, or not the prophet, but the patriarch Isaac, who in his old days can't see well. Remember, his eyes are dimmed. And then there's the whole story of Jacob and Esau. So how does she manage with her dimming eye capacities? Well, she is blessed with the fact that most of the major prayer books, and we use a set liturgy in books, most of these prayer books have large print editions. There's even Braille editions of these books. So I'm happy about that. On the other hand, Temple Bethel, where I have served now this is my 4th year, has a bima, which is a pulpit, that there's no way for a wheelchair to get to it. So we have to acknowledge that. That's architecture that, if I were a rich man, maybe I could be able to fix that. But right now we can't. We made comments about Zoom. We have Zoom, and Zoom has allowed a lot of home-based congregants to still participate, people who have lost their capacity to get around. Now, there's still a loss there, and we need to acknowledge that too. Where's the communal aspect? So we have to work on that as well. All of us are created B'Tselem Elohim. All human beings are created in God's image. In the Mishnah, which is around 200 CE, Christians say AD, we say CE. It says, a human being mints many coins from the same mold. They are all identical. But the Holy One of Blessing strikes all from the mold of the first human, and each one of us is unique. So instead of categorizing people as other because they have a disability, which is already a not great word that I think eventually we'll get rid of, look at it as there really is a diversity of human expression in this world. It says also in our tradition that when you see someone with a disfigured face or limbs, there's a special blessing you say. Blessed are you, our God, ruler of the universe, who makes people different. So when you see someone who looks a little different, you give them a blessing by saying, oh, there's a difference, right? One who sees a person who is blind or disabled, physically unable to move, that we used to use the word lame, or who is covered with sores and other like leprosy or something along those lines, recites the blessing. Blessed are you, our God, ruler of the universe, who is a righteous judge. But it says that if they were born that way with a disability, in other words, something happened to them, and so perhaps it's some sort of divine punishment that they have those things. But if they were born that way, then you just go back to blessed are you, God, who makes people different. It's interesting kind of a tension between what is naturally a person's destiny versus an injury along the way and how it is understood in the tradition. And there's a text, Maimonides, who was probably our greatest scholar, medieval scholar, around 1200, says, every member of the people of Israel is obligated to study Torah, whether one is rich or poor, physically able or with physical disability. So they're included by the requirement to be in relationship with God. All people are. And another way to understand this, even though we may not do a good job with it, is to think, okay, disability or other ability or limited ability, however we want to understand it, is just another category of othering that goes along with others. The Torah speaks of not oppressing the stranger, the widow, or the orphan. These are the three most economically disadvantaged groups. The stranger, meaning someone who's a foreigner, right, who doesn't have the network nearby. The orphan, someone who does not have a parent who has financial capacities to make money, and therefore you live a life of poverty. Similarly with the widow. So these three are seen as our least protected members of society. By extension, one could say that that would also include people with disabilities. In the book of Proverbs, it says, Chanoch l'na'ar al pi darko, teach a child according to their way. A couple fast things, because I think I'm running out of time. Rabbi Ruti Reagan is the first openly autistic person to be ordained by the conservative seminary. Rabbi Laura Tuckman is the first blind woman ordained as a rabbi. And I've known several deaf rabbis along the way. And so I would say there's a lot of other forms of disabilities. In our congregation, wine is a part of our rituals. We make sure that there's grape juice, right? It's one of those things. But I would ask all of us, do we provide rides to our houses of worship? Do we have a system in place to check in weekly with weekly attendees? In Jewish community, finding a partner, a shidduch, right? Some of you probably watched Jewish Matchmaking or whatever that show is on Netflix. It's a big deal. Are we, in our efforts to find love, pointing people toward pointing disabled people with physical limit or emotional or mental limitations only to those who are also similarly struggling with disability? Or do we think beyond that to say, okay, just because the person's in a wheelchair, look, they're a lawyer, they can do law really well and have intimacy and all the other things. Why are we deciding for them who's their right partner? And do we speak about neurodiversity nearly enough? Do we bias toward physical health or mental health? And yes, it's true. In Jewish law, people with certain mental health capacities or limitations are excluded as witnesses in the courts, and that's a challenge. Do we teach disability equality, or do we just take pity on those who we consider less fortunate? Are we okay with them, or are they othered endlessly as being sources of pity? I also am an animal guy. I don't know if this will show up. There's this wonderful book. It's called Beasts of Burden, and it's animal and disability liberation. I just wanted to make a plug that people are thinking about this in the animal rights movement as well. I'll just say a couple last things, and I know I need to go. My brother didn't know he was any different. Jewish mystics say that people with Down syndrome are on a higher spiritual plane. All of us on some level are disabled, in that none of us are immortal. We have limitations. So what audacity for us to claim some superiority when we're just going to die like everyone else. Now, that could be a very pessimistic way to say it. Maybe it's a little bit like the book of Ecclesiastes would say it. But let's recognize that we're all in this together. And at the same time as our mortality and our fallibility is true, we are also the crown of creation, the last beings created in the divine pathway to creation. And we were all created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, whether we are disabled or not, whether we are fully abled or not, whether we're smart or we're not, on so many levels. So my prayer for all of us is that we expand. By the way, I have to be critical here. We didn't do captioning, and there you go. I mean, it's not hard for us to make mistakes, but let's be kind to ourselves too, and just pay attention to those around us. Thank you.
Rabbi, I didn't even notice. There we go. I did not even notice that the captioning wasn't on, but it actually was a part of our plan for this evening. So I apologize for that. It was something we wanted to do, and I didn't even
open critique. I really didn't.
No, it's perfect. It absolutely goes to show how easy it is to overlook coming from an able perspective. It is just heartbreaking in so many different ways. Thank you, Rabbi. Before we go into questions for the actual panelists this evening, a piece of this program tonight was to invite people who are disabled to share an experience that they have had with religion or religious institutions. And we do have one person that said that they would like to speak, Miriam Gaineke. And if there are others here listening this evening that would like to have something that they would like to share regarding an individual experience that you have had as a person with a disability, please let me or Paul know in the chat. But now I'd like to introduce Miriam Gaineke.
Hello. Am I unmuted here? Yes. Hello, I'm Miriam Gaineke. Pardon the dog. I am a spontaneous spinal cord injury survivor and traumatic brain injury survivor, and it is miraculous that I am actually on the planet. Dr. Timothy Weeb was my neurosurgeon at the time. He's joining us as well. So our faith community at Emmanuel has been excellent. I've always thought of myself as a child of God and receiving God's grace. And everything else that Rabbi Jonathan Klein said hit everything on the nail, in my opinion. Thank you.
That's it.
Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about any experiences you've had?
I've never worked so hard in my entire life. Everything else is easy.
Thank you.
Gee whiz. Well, thank you everybody for it's been really a good experience, and I'm glad everything is being discussed. This is close to my heart for many years, for many reasons. Initially, as a school teacher, aware of so many things like the differences amongst my students, and that a few things that I've learned over the years, and I myself am to utilize the term differently abled. I interesting things, and they've had an impact on the way I've approached things over the years. At one point was taking special education classes, and Ann Gallen, wherever you are, I just told her, I had a class in retardation to get a special, and the professor gave an assignment to watch Saturday morning cartoons, and this was probably in, and the whole point of the exercise, and it was that if you looked at Saturday morning cartoons at that time and even earlier, most of the were drawn to have the features of someone who was other. They could be very mongoloid features, or looking people who look different. And in those cartoons, the joke was ridiculing that particular character. And the point of the professor was, or wherever else those kind of cartoons are shown, and we learn to mock and ridicule. And that was a very eye-opening experience for me to think about that. In addition, I called adventitious disability, and it's something that I certainly have. The young woman who just spoke about the spinal cord injury has the same thing, and it's a disability you get when you did not have that disability before. So you weren't born, and something happens. You could be in a car accident. Anything could happen that changes you. And in my, I wasn't blind before. And you go through a sequence of mourning, on and on and on. But, you know, the rabbi ways to be more inclusive, and it is really hard. You know, having that's hard. I learned from a friend who had broken her hip, and I recently broke my hip, and I'm experiencing some interesting things in a wheelchair. People don't look simple. You're down below everybody. There's so sensitive to, I guess. And as the rabbi said, we do it differently. you know, I've often thought that I was blindsided by losing my vision, but I have vision. And I put that vision out in the world where differently than I did before. And it took experiencing this reality and other people. You know, I have a friend, an artist, who painted with his brush, but made beautiful artwork. So there are so many different challenges. People try to welcome the gifts and open up their hearts as well as their facilities. So that's all. I just the in many different ways. So thank you for all your sharing, and the acorn story.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. As we move into our question section of this, I want to acknowledge one of the questions that we received was from Martha, who is Catholic. And she asked if there was any way for a special needs person to be able to get their sacraments. And this would be specifically around an intellectual disability. And I talked a little bit about this with the panelists ahead of this evening, and there's an agreement that probably to simply talk to the priest would be the easiest way to be able to facilitate that. Another question we had for this evening is from Jennifer. Do you have any religious writers or other media, hymns, passages from religious texts that come to mind when a disabled religious person is looking for encouragement? And I'll put that out to any one of our or all of our panelists this evening.
I'm not sure we approach it that way in a way. You know, I mean, I gave a few texts about, for instance, the book of Proverbs, about, you know, the way in which you approach a child's education from the place that they come from. I could expand on that and just say, you know, on Passover, we have these 4 children that are mentioned: a wise one, a wicked one. These are how they're characterized: wise, wicked, simple, and one unable to ask. And simple may mean not so bright, right? And the whole point of that part of the Haggadah, where we read from on Passover, is to say you approach each child from where they come from. And, you know, if they have capacity to be a genius, you know, to be a genius leader, you approach them from that perspective. If they have some anger, or maybe they're perceived as wicked or evil or something along those lines, you don't just abandon them altogether. You address them with that in mind. And of course, I don't agree with the approach. It's a little bit strong arming, and you gnaw their teeth is kind of what it says. But still, there's a question of how do you approach people from where they are coming from. And the simple child, you say, who says, "What is this?" And without a lot of complexity. And we know there are people with intelligence limitations or severe learning disabilities. You don't exclude them. They're at the Seder table as well. So I don't know. I guess that would be my best answer, that there are thoughts about looking at I think the answer to that, and that text in particular, is saying you don't just simplify your system to say, you know, everyone is the same, and therefore we are just going to do it one way. We're going to create color. We're going to enjoy the mosaic of the community. And it's not just ethnic or racial diversity, but it's things that have to do with mental health and and neurodiversity and all of those things.
I might suggest looking at the stories in the New Testament of people who have disabilities, who live with disabilities. I like Bartimaeus and the man born blind in John, and regarding them as real people. I find that encouraging.
Miriam wrote, I was grieving my former life. I also want to just say that there's rituals that people do to transition from one situation to another, and ritual is important. And the mikvah is often used for all sorts of transitions, and probably underutilized, but a lot of Jewish feminist thinkers have really taken to the mikvah as a way to ritualize various things: divorces, loss of loved ones, retirements, whatever it is that people are going through.
We have a question from the chat, and it is from Christy. Do you think it is possible that the New Testament's emphasis on healing, curing, making whole has led to Western medicine's emphasis on treating disease and healing and operating, etc.? That medical view of disability, rather than focusing on preventative medicine to prevent disease.
Well, the question is it possible? Certainly. I don't know that I've seen anybody kind of check that out and make that connection. I wonder, I think it's more of the scientific approach that has turned the human body into a thing to be fixed often, and lost track of the whole person that we might find in other approaches to medicine.
Are there any other questions this evening for our panel? Feel free to raise a hand. I see Elise Sotelo.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight and speaking on this. I don't have so much a question, but just something that I was thinking about, especially with what was just said. I took American Sign Language in college, and I remember a lot of the class was not just about the language, but also about deaf culture, and deaf with a capital D. I learned that was a thing. Before that, I didn't know that there was lowercase d and capital D. And I remember learning about how there were people within the deaf community with a capital D who were upset because at that time cochlear implants were brand new, and they were allowing children, who were born deaf to hear. And it was a big controversy because there were people with the capital D saying, this is our culture, this is who we are, why would you want to change that? And then other people saying, I have this opportunity for my kid to hear, why wouldn't I take that opportunity? And it was just very interesting. It gave me a perspective that I had never had before. And also something I've been learning, I'm a teacher, but I'm very active in the teachers union, and I'm a cadre trainer, a human rights cadre trainer. And my usual focus is LGBTQ plus issues. But right now I'm working with some other cadre trainers to work on a disability justice workshop for teachers. And something that I'm learning is that that activists within the community are very much wanting people to take a assets-based approach rather than deficit-based. And I think that was touched upon tonight about, what can people bring to the table rather than what you can't bring to the table, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, not really a question, but just some thoughts that were provoked from tonight's talk. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Elise. I think that we do have wonderful assets that people carry for that, you know, and maybe on some level, you know, we always know about these folks who are wheelchair bound, who have amazing capacities with their arms, you know, the way in which there's compensations that give them gifts. And so it's just interesting. I think that's why the blessing is, you know, God, blessed are you, God, who makes different, you know, different people, you know, that varies the humans. It's beautiful.
I'm holding my, can you hear me now? Yeah, I appreciated hearing that different abilities are accepted. Alan, Salazar, I appreciated your storytelling because that is a way to reach people in a way that books and lecturing doesn't reach the public sometimes. But in your story, you had different people in the village all were appreciated for their different abilities. And in our Christian faith, I think it's in Romans, we talk about the different talents that people have, and that's important. And in the book, Rebecca Tausig wrote about the different things she would like to do, some things she couldn't do so well, but she would like people with disabilities to still be able to provide their talents, tell their stories, and achieve more if they had physical help along the way. And I do have a question for Dr. Afaki. I was interested in your Islamic law talking about spiritual disabilities that are self-inflicted. Could you expand on that for me a little bit?
Yes, so it goes back to the point that it really emerges from Islamic theology, and then it translates into principles for Islamic law. So there's this fundamental notion in Islamic theology that the soul is born in a kind of a state of equilibrium fundamentally. So we all come to the world with certain gifts, certain capacities, but we also carry certain burdens. And those burdens may be physical, they may be intellectual, they may be visible, or they may be invisible. They may be tied to our situation or to our personhood itself. What's emphasized in Islamic theology is that we draw upon our capacities to make positive contributions. Spiritual disability emerges when we either neglect our God-given capacities. There are some metaphors that are used, such as there are black spots that emerge on the heart being a kind of a representation of the soul as well. And our soul eventually, the more we neglect our spiritual duties, the more our soul becomes, in a sense, negligent and lazy itself. And so as time goes by, when we fail to use our capacities properly, the soul just drowns in sin as we go forward. And so it enters a state of spiritual disability that emerges from our negligence. We did not emerge that way, but because we fail to exercise our capacities in a proper way, we kind of enter a path of sin, and then we keep walking on it. Does that help answer your question? You're muted, but okay.
Okay. My last comment was that I appreciated the PowerPoints you provided.
Oh, I'm happy to email them to you as well, and many journal articles.
Yeah, Diane's got her hand raised.
Diane.
It's really funny, but what he just said sort of made me go on a different track from what I was originally going to say, because I wasn't really going to ask a question. I had more like, when Christy first posted this on Facebook, I was like, oh yes, I'm in 1000%. I have a 35-year-old son who is cognitively, emotionally, and physically impaired. But he's a wonderful, wonderful young man. Christy will tell you that too. But I have always gone to church. My whole life I've gone to church. I was raised Methodist, converted to Catholicism, and then got divorced and felt like the church was going to cave in on me if I walked in the doors again. So we switched back to something. It wasn't Methodist, but it was a church that just kind of felt good. And then my son got to be about 8 or 9 and really struggled with some things as he matured. And we found that the church was no longer a friendly place for him. And I get, everything I've heard tonight made me think of so many different things. But now I'm worried about his, I've read the Bible to him. I have not read him Revelations, but I have read him Genesis. He liked that very much. But so I guess what I'm saying is, am I hurting him by keeping this from him now, since he had that really terrible time there for a while? How do I make church a safe place for him again? Does any of that make sense? Or any religion? Honestly, right now, I want to be American Indian because I loved the way they do it. And it's like, if my grandfather just would have married my grandmother before my dad was born, But yeah, it's just a thought. And then I noticed Terry said what I was going to say too. And I say this with the deepest respect, but the term now is wheelchair user, because a wheelchair is considered a tool and it's not something that someone is stuck in all day.
He said they had flagged the hound, that's why it came out. And I said, what was the violation? They said, false interference. They said last week he got called.
Yeah, but that, sorry, go ahead, please.
As the member of the panel who represents the Christian Church, thank you, Dawn. I want to apologize to you that you think you need to make the church a safe place for your son. You should not have to make the church a safe place for your son. Jesus would welcome your son. And I think there are churches out there that would welcome you and your son. I'm sorry that they may be hard to find. I bet Pastor Dawn could point you in a right direction. I would help, but I'm a long way from California.
And I will help. It may not necessarily be our church that you would feel comfortable in. I'm not saying you won't, but I would help you find a community that would openly welcome him. I know we would. We don't have many children at our church, so I'm not sure how.
Yeah, but isn't he 35?
Oh, he's 35 now.
Oh,
so
okay.
Here's my other take on that,
right.
though, is like, and I try not to hold this feeling because I feel like it's a negative feeling and I don't care for those. But it's like, if he wasn't good enough for him at his worst, then they don't deserve him at his best. And he's easy now. He's easy peasy.
Right.
Yeah. And that's,
If I can touch on
tragic. Yes, Alan.
This is something that I've said for a long time, but I've been saying it more and more recently. We're all tribal people. So everyone, all these picture panels, and I'm looking at about 12 right now. We all come from tribal cultures, and being someone that was raised as Indian, indigenous, Native American, whatever label you want to put on us. I was raised to embrace my tribal beliefs. My mom was Portuguese and English. Her people were tribal and had tribal beliefs. And I just want to touch on one thing. As a tribal person in America, we went from being the largest group. We were the dominant group 500 years ago. There were more of us than there were of you guys. And we went from that to being one of the smallest minorities and groups in America. So what that has done, at least for me personally, it's made me to really dislike labels. And I think that's what we're talking about tonight, putting labels on people. I have never wanted anyone to label me, sit down and talk to me and get to know me. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are my dreams? What are my goals? What's important to me? It's one of the things why I left the Catholic Church when I turned 18. My ancestors were brought to the San Fernando Mission starting in 1799. My father was a good Catholic. My grandmother was a good Catholic. My grandfather was a good Catholic. But when I turned 18, I left the Catholic Church because of that one simple belief that what the religions, Western religions, believe for the most part, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, is that your beliefs are the gospel. Our beliefs are what we believe, how we observe the world. And I'll sit down and change them and adjust them when I sit down and talk to people. And that was the point I was trying to make a little bit earlier. I think the spoken word in today's world is very important, that we need to sit down and talk to each other, find out what we have in common as opposed to what we don't have in common. Everyone on these picture panels, I can almost guarantee you, I'm pretty sure, and like I said, I'm the least educated everyone in here tonight. I am pretty sure we have more things in common than we do differences. For some reason or another, we focus on the differences. We need to focus on what we have in common. I apologize for rambling and getting on my soapbox.
Thank you so much. And I enjoyed that soapbox. I don't think any one of us could say it better. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists this evening for joining us, and all of those who had questions. And our last comment in the chat is Mr. Salazar. I agree with you wholeheartedly. So thank you all so much for being here with us this evening.
Pastor?
Yes?
And I could put one final plug in terms
Yes.
of why we're having this discussion tonight. I want to remind you, and I want to thank you too. I think we created that lively conversation we hoped for. I want to remind you that the Onebook authors are not just good writers, but they are also great speakers. In fact, one of the requirements of choosing any year's book is that the author must be alive and must be willing to come to Bakersfield and talk and sign books for everyone in attendance at CSUB at the Icardo Center. So this year, the author will appear on Thursday, October 26th at the Icardo Center, 7 p.m. And so often it is a high point of the Onebook event, because these authors really do have profound things to share. And with that, I will say again, thank you and good night.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. It was great to talk to all of you. I learned a lot
you.
from you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.